Welcome back, people. You already know it's me, Bryce from Develop Mindfully, and let's continue writing our CSV to map web app. So picking up where we left off last time, we added the HTML and CSS to flesh out the interface of our web app, and it now looks like this. And now we're ready to dig into some JavaScript for our interactions and establishing data flow through the sections. So as I mentioned before, our simple single-page app consists of just showing and hiding sections in this following flow. So moving from the home section to the import section, then we can freely move back and forth between the import and field section, and also back and forth between the fields and route section. So to define the functions that we're going to need to move between these sections, I'm going to make a new folder called Interactions under our root.js folder there. I'm going to make a new file called Navigation. And we're going to import jQuery into this file. Now I'm just going to copy and paste these functions one by one since they're all kind of the same, just to save you the repetitive nature. So we have one function here called go to import section. What this is going to do is just going to hide the home section and expose the import section. Similarly, we have the go to field section function. Then we have this one here, which is return to import. So it's just basically undoing the actions from the one before it. Next we have skip to route section. And this one will come in later with the workflow where we want to import a JSON file and skip right to our map. And then we have another one called go to route section that's moving from after we select our fields to going to the screen with the map. And lastly, we have one more called return to field section. Great, so with those in place, let's import these functions into our main index.js file. And what that looks like is this. Now we won't implement them all, we won't call them all right now, but we are going to need all of them eventually, so I'm just going to leave that there. And now we just need to add a click event listener to the button in the home section. That's that getting started button. So to do that, we're going to do a simple jQuery select the get started button. We're going to apply click function to that, and then using an ES6 arrow function, we're going to call the go to import section method, and that will hide the home section and create the effect of us moving to the import section. And once we arrive there, we just also want to select the import button and make sure it's disabled. We don't want them to be able, we don't want the user to be able to proceed until they have selected a file to import, whether that be a CSV file or a JSON file. So we're going to save that. Alright, so since the page is reloaded, we're going to try clicking the get started button, and you can see we are able to move to our import data section. So here we have our two file inputs, one for the CSV files and one for the JSON files, and our import button, which is stuck being disabled. So we'll add some code shortly that will allow us to handle our files that we want to import, but first we need to write some functions to help us store and retrieve data client-side, and also help us parse our CSV and JSON files. So returning to our code, I'm going to create a new folder under JS now called Utils, and within here I'm going to create two new files, one called storage.js and another one called file.js. So now throughout this web app, we want to be able to store and retrieve the data on demand. So in a more sophisticated web app, we would do this through an API call, interacting with some data store or by some other means. But here we're going to just use the web storage API offered by modern browsers, and we're going to use localStorage to achieve this, which acts as basically just a simple key value store, and we will wrap the logic for interacting with localStorage into two simple functions. So the first of which is just going to be store, and it's going to look like this. So store, const store, and this is going to be an arrow function. It's going to accept two arguments called key and value, and then from there we're going to use the local storage object, and we're going to call setItem, which will accept the key passed in as the argument, and then the value, which will be the JSON stringified value passed into the function as an argument. So this just makes sure the value is stored as text as is required. And then we're going to define one more function to retrieve data. So export const retrieve, and that'll only take key as an argument. And then this time we're going to wrap the whole thing in the parse method from the JSON object, wrapped around local storage get item at the key that we pass in as the argument. So that'll just make sure that even if it comes in as text, it'll be parsed and ready to be used in our code. So we'll save that. And if we switch now to our file utilities, here we're going to need to write a couple of functions to parse the contents of the CSV and JSON files into data structures that we can use in our app. So we can start that out with export const parse CSV. This will be our function. And we pass in text as the argument to that. And from this function, we want to return two sets of information from our CSV file. The names of our column headings, which we'll call fields, and then also the rows of data themselves, which we'll call data. The rows will be processed basically into an array of objects and will be stored under this field data. And just in case you've never seen this before, this is just the short form of returning an object where the field names are the same as the variable names. So this is equivalent to fields, data fields. It just is a shorthand, a little bit prettier. So this task is like a fun programming assignment, taking a full line of text from a file and parsing it into a useful structure. Also, it's not too complicated to understand. If we have a quick look at our CSV file again, it's in a predictable format, right? So even though we can't see it, each line is separated by the new line character as well as the carriage return. That's how the lines are spaced apart. And then within each given line, we have our different data values that are separated by commas, hence CSV. So naturally, our first step would be to break the entire file into an array of each of these lines. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to take the text, and in a variable called lines, we're going to split that text at those carriage return and new line characters. So even though you can't see them in this representation, they are there. That's how the lines are separated, and we begin a new line each time. So great. Now we're going to also add a condition based on the number of lines. So if we have less than 3 lines in a file, that means that we have at least, at most, 1 line of column headings and 1 line of data. And this just isn't enough for what we want our app to be able to do. We want to have at least 1 line of column headings and 2 lines of data for a total of 3, so that we could at least create a route between 2 locations, because we want to be later on down the line using our map to make a route with stops between locations. So if we do have less than 3 lines, we want to return null. So now we're going to initialize an array that will hold our data. That will be coming in for each row. And then on top of that, we want to now retrieve the column headings. So basically that first line of text from our file, which will give us the names of the column headings, or you can call them fields, whatever you like. So to do that, we're going to, in a variable called fields, we're going to look at our first line out of our array of lines, our 0th element, and we're going to split that line at the comma, and that will give us an array of those column headings, all stored in this variable fields. So now that we know the field names, we have an array to hold our data. We basically just need to loop over every line after the first line and split the string at each comma, kind of as we did here, and use this with the field names to create JSON objects, which will serve as the new structure for the data. So this sounds a bit confusing, but let me just show you what I mean. So if our CSV file looks like this, right? So we have column A, column B, and column C, and then we have some values going down. We want to basically transform this into this JavaScript representation where we have an array, and within each array we have an object where the value for each column corresponds now as an attribute, right? So for column A we have 1, column B we have 2, column C we have 3, and then each row basically represents a data point or its own object in the JSON representation. So by respecting this pattern, we are converting our data from rows into objects, and we can easily retrieve the value for a given field using this new representation. So I'm just going to format this just to make it nice. Save it, and so we'll begin by defining a loop. So within our loop, we will let our counter variable here begin at 1, because we want to start actually at the second line, since the first line contains the column headings. And we're going to continue doing this until we go through the remainder of the lines, so until we reach the total number of lines and the length. And we're going to increment that. Now, within this loop, we're going to want to declare a value called row, which will represent a fresh JSON object, basically. And we will also want to grab the values for that given row by splitting the line at position I on the comma character. All right, so far so good. Stay with me. And now we're going to do one more loop within this loop, because we have to actually go through the values now and assign the attribute to this row object with the proper field name and also this value, right? So we need to actually assign the attribute column A, for example, and we need to match up the value that is at that position to that attribute. So we're going to do that within a loop, because we don't know how many we actually don't know how many fields there are, but we do have our array of field names that we have up here. So we can use that array and the length of that array to find the limit of how many values to process. So within this loop, we're going to define another counter variable, j is equal to 0. Now, and while j is less than the number of fields dot length, we'll increment j, and within this loop we're going to take our row object and, using the brackets to define an attribute within that object, we're going to use the field name that exists at that position j, and then at the same position j we're going to assign the value for the line that we're currently in up here. So we have a nested loop happening here, and once this is completed, our row object will be complete, and then we can push this row object onto our array of data. I know that sounds a little complicated, but just if you have to, even go back, just listen carefully to the way I'm explaining it. But essentially what we're doing is we're remapping this representation to this representation. It's going to be a lot easier to work with, and you may even just learn a little bit of programming through this process too. So once this outer loop is complete, we'll have our array of data completely filled, and we also have the field names as before, so those will be returned to the point calling the function. And while we're here, we need one more function, and that'll be for defining, for parsing our JSON file. So we won't be getting to that feature just yet. We'll be circling back, but while we're here, we might as well just write that out as well. So I'm going to write export const parse JSON, and that's going to accept text once again. But this time, all we're going to have to do is just call the parse method on the JSON object on that text, and that will return to us the data in a usable JSON format. Great, so we've written some useful logic. Now let's incorporate it into an interaction with our HTML file input. So switching back to our main index.js file, we're going to scroll down to this section I've created here in our main document ready listener, and let's select the CSV file input, and we're going to call the change function on that to add a change event listener to the CSV file input. And I'm just going to duplicate this. We'll apply this. We won't fill this one out right away, but we're going to apply another one to the JSON file input as well. So we're going to be making use of the within this event object, we'll select target and then files to get access to the files that we upload through this input. Now the file will actually be read using JavaScript's file reader object, and we're going to use some extra logic to wrap around that. So we'll go over to our interactions folder, and we're going to create a new file called import.js. And in here we're going to import our parse CSV and parse JSON functions that we just wrote. And that will be from parent/utils file. Now we're going to create a function called handle CSV file change, and this is going to accept the array of files that will be inside the event object, as well as a callback method that we were going to supply later on. And the callback for now is going to have this structure to it. So it's the first argument is going to accept any error that might be present, followed by the file name, and then followed by the file contents. So at the very beginning, we want to begin by doing some error checking. So if files.length is less than 1, meaning if we don't have any files present, don't have at least one file present, then we want to return our callback with an error that just leaves the label looking the same. So choose CSV file. That'll be the error message. That'll be displayed in the label of the file input. And then obviously we will have no file name or file contents present, so we're going to pass in two nulls. And from there, if we pass that condition, then we can accept that we can grab the file from the first element, 0th element of the files array. And then we're going to just do some quick type checking on that file. So if file.type does not equal the text/CSV MIME type, and if the file name does not, so we're going to put a not at the beginning of this, does not include .csv as part of the name, then we can assume that the user has picked a file that isn't a CSV file, so we're going to return with calling our callback method with a message of invalid file type must be a CSV file. And then once again passing in null for the file detail arguments. And if we make it past there, then we can assume that we're working with a CSV file. So we're going to begin by initializing a new file reader object. So we're going to create a variable called file reader. We're going to initialize that object. And Now we have to supply a callback to the file reader's onload attribute. And the reason why we have to do that is because the file reader will load our file asynchronously and needs us to assign this function to take care of processing the contents of the file when they're ready. So in this onload, we're going to be another event object that's supplied here, and that's going to contain the results. And from here, we're going to call our callback method that's defined here. Again, this is the callback that's defined by us. And if you're not used to asynchronous programming, I'll walk us through it once we're at the higher level. So from here, we're going to pass in, there are no errors in this case if it loads successfully. So we're going to pass in null for error. I'm going to pass in the name of the file as the file name. And then for the file contents, we're going to first of all pass once this file reader object is loaded, we're going to get the target and then the result of the file being read. And we're going to pass this into our parse CSV function. So again, we know from having written this method that this will be just the text content of that CSV file. And it will, the whole processing down to the field names and the data will be handled by this method. So we can save that. Now there's just a couple other callbacks that there's one other callback that we want to define, the onError callback, just in the event of something going wrong. That will contain the error, and in this case we want to still call our callback, but this time passing in the error, and then passing in null for the file name and for the file contents, just as we have up above here. And finally, to kickstart the process of reading, we want to call the file reader's read as text method. And this will begin to read, and we're going to pass in the file, obviously, to begin that process. And this will begin the process asynchronously, and again, the onload will be called once it's finished being read, and that will call our callback. Great, so let's go back to our index.js file, and let's actually call this function using our event listener here that we defined for our CSV file input. So we're going to call, we're going to have to import it as well. So we're going to import handle CSV from /interaction/import, and we're going to call that. So we're going to be passing in the event object target and then files, as I mentioned before, and then our callback, which will be error and then file name and then contents, as per the callback that we defined in our file here. And then within the body of that callback, we will begin by checking first if there's an error. So if there is an error, we want to return from this, not move any further within the body of this function, and we're going to select the CSV file label just so we can display to the user the the error message that we specified, depending on what's the case. Now, assuming it passes that, then we want to actually store the data and the fields from the file contents. So we're going to call that, and it's going to do an auto import for us because we didn't do that, our store method that we defined before, so we can put the data and also the fields into our local storage. So we're going to store at the key data, the contents, the data contents, like that. And then we're also going to store the fields. So these are the column headings or field names, whatever you'd like to call them. Contents.fields. Again, accessing that because it's passed into our callback. I'm going to save. Now, just to get a preview, I'm going to just drop a couple of console log statements here, just so we can see this in action. Oh, and I forgot a number sign here, just to properly select that. That's okay, that's how we learn. So it's just going to recompile. So then if we come over here, we reveal the development tools. Now if we choose our CSV file, I'm just going to pick that sample file that we have in our repo. There we are. We can see down here that we have the data nicely imported and parsed into these convenient objects that we can access. And also we have the field names at our disposal too. And as per these store calls down here, we also have them stored in local storage, so we can call them as we need them using their retrieve function that we wrote. So then we're just going to make some changes to the UI just to reflect the action that just took place. So the CSV file label, instead of saying the message of choose a CSV file, we're going to want to change the text in there to say file colon, and then we'll put in the actual file name. So it'll just display the file name that we chose, just to kind of be a visual cue that we did pick a file. And then from there, because we have two file inputs that are could potentially be accessed kind of at the same time before hitting that import button, we're going to just make sure if the CSV file is being used, we're going to actually clear out anything that might be in that JSON file input, because we won't be able to select both at the same time. It's kind of a choose one or the other type scenario, right? So moving there, so we're going to change the text to reset it to the default. And then the other thing we want to do on that JSON file input is set the value using the val function in jQuery just to an empty string, just in case there was a file that was selected there. We just want to clear that out. And lastly, we want to remove the disabled statement from our import button, and that's going to let us move on to the next step. We have to define what that button does still, but we don't want it to be disabled any longer because we successfully processed the file. And then lastly, we just want to, in the next section, as we'll see, there's a little file summary span that kind of, it just reads off like the number of rows that are in the file name. We just want to basically update that. We won't be able to see it in this step. Oh, sorry, we want to use number sign. And that's going to be at the ID file summary span. And we're going to set the HTML within there to be in bold. We want the contents.data.length. That'll give us the number of rows, so it's the number of records in that data array. And we're going to put, just close that bold HTML there. Rows from, and then bold again, file name, and then close that bold tag again. So again, this is just going to read out, there's a little message there, and in the specific span, we're just going to change it to say this many rows from this file. I'm just going to save that. Great, so just to recap, we've written a clean process now for reading and parsing our CSV file, and then writing it to the browser's local storage. So we've come a long way. And if we look here, we have a nice UI forming now where this can happen for us very quickly. Such a simple thing, but we did quite a bit of work to get there. And again, we'll circle back to write the JSON import side of this step after we've completed the CSV import workflow. So just returning to the code now, we just want to define now the import buttons event click listener. So if we go to, if we use number sign import button, I'm going to apply a click listener to this, and within here we want to disable, first of all, our file inputs. So just, in the brief fraction of time between when we click that button, if there's any kind of delay, we don't want the user interfering with those file inputs. So we're just going to set disabled to true on this, and I'm just going to duplicate this statement. The same thing will apply to the JSON file input. Oh, and we're missing our number sign there as well. Great. And then finally, just for good measure, we want to create some booleans just to check if there is a file present in either of these file inputs. So we're going to, once again, use these, and I'm going to check for a value. So based on the result of this in this ternary expression, we're just going to set it to true if there is a value. If not, we'll set it to false, and that'll be based upon JavaScript's ability to check if this is a falsy type value. And we're going to do another statement for checking if the file is JSON. Now, we're just doing this really for the sake of being thorough, and this is, again, just for the case where if the user is selecting more than one file at once, we want to just do one path. We want to do either the CSV path or the JSON path. And basically, it's going to come down to which one was done more recently, and it's going to check if there is if either of them are present, and then we're going to have some conditions down here that say if it is a CSV file, if it is the CSV path, we want to do this set of steps. Otherwise, we want, if it is a JSON path, we want to do this set of steps. And we will be defining what happens there in the next part of the tutorial. So thank you so much for watching, and if you're enjoying this tutorial, please support this video by clicking like, and also subscribe to Develop Mindfully if you'd like to see more content like this. We'll see you in the next one.